What happened in Rendlesham Forest in 1980? That incident is certainly one of the best documented UFO cases in history, but it is also one of the most complex ones. Joining me now is former police detective Gary Heseltine, who has just completed a 5-year reinvestigation of the entire case. Welcome, Gary Heseltine.
Thank you, Robert, for having me as a guest.
You have served 6 years in the Royal Air Force. You have then served 24 years in the British Transport Police, 19 years of which you worked as a detective and as a qualified advanced interviewer of suspects and witnesses. And you have just released this new book that I'll show here, Non-Human, the Rendlesham Forest UFO Incidents, 42 Years of Denial. Now, that is a cold case reinvestigation. As a former police detective, I mean, one would assume that it wouldn't take so long. So why did it take you 5 years to reinvestigate it?
The Rendlesham Forest case is extremely complex, arguably the most complex case in UFO history, in my opinion. And the reason why that is because there are so many moving parts. This is not just one sighting, one event. This is, as my book concludes, 17 different events over a 3 to 4 day consecutive period in late December 1980. So this is things that are going on all the time in different parts of the forest. There is also things that's happening over the twin bases at RAF Woodbridge and RAF Bentwater. So this is a very moving, fluid incident. And I actually think that there's a lot more that we still don't know because some of the witnesses have never actually gone on the record with that or been interviewed, what I would say, in any depth. So it's a very complex case. And if I was going to do a reinvestigation, it had to be as thorough as I could make it. So that meant literally examine anything I could find written historical-wise, whether it be an old TV interview or old references to online interviews, going right back literally from the day after the incidents have occurred. And that took a long time. And then, of course, you've got to be able to then think, well, how do I actually write a book? How do I actually put this hugely complex story together? And that took a while. I would say it took 6 months for me to just realize what would be the best approach. And then you're still tweaking things as you go along. As things actually fall into place, it meant a lot of re-interviews, trying to contact people who'd maybe gone and given a testimony before, but through my advanced interviewing skills, I thought there was maybe a chance that they would give me more information. And in a couple of really important interviews with a guy called Steve Longero and another one of Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, I applied an advanced technique called the Enhanced Cognitive Method, ECM, and it actually worked to a degree. Bear in mind that this technique is not designed to be done 40 plus years after the event. It's to be done within days of an event. But the whole principle is based on if you've experienced something that's really traumatic, a lot of information will be stored in your brain, because it's a bit like a computer or a video camera in some ways. And if you just know how to trigger memory releases through training, and the person is willing, in a sense, to concentrate their mind back on the incident, then you can elicit new information. And it led to a lot of new information. So it worked on a couple of occasions.
And we will certainly go into that. Now, before we continue, may I ask you to walk us through the case in as few words as possible, because many people in Germany will probably not be aware of that case, even though it is so famous. What happened in those nights back in December 1980?
Okay, a quick summary is that basically this is a series of UFO sightings. This is not one incident. It's at least 17 different incidents at different times taking place not only in Rendlesham Forest, which lay between two US bases leased from the British called RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge. And the forest was in the middle, and the bases were about 45 miles away from each other. So you've got the forest in the middle, and this is late December. There still is some confusion about precise dates for some of the accounts, but it's generally now regarded as Christmas night into Boxing Day, so the 25th into the 26th, and then more incidents take place on the 26th, Boxing Day into the 27th, and then more incidents take place on the 27th into the 28th. And my book research and the new testimony from Sergeant Adrian Bustinza suggests that there's actually a fourth night, which would be the 28th of December into the 29th of December. So hugely complicated, potentially hundreds of people are involved collectively in those sightings. Collectively, maybe 30 or 40 have given a security police, US Air Force security police officers have at some point in the last 42 years given some testimony, but many still haven't, and we're aware of other people who are named but have never come forward. So the reinvestigation is a hugely complex story because it's not just one event. It's a multiple series of events. But I mean, breaking those down, there's a very famous US Air Force document that emerged in early, about April 1983, and it's become very famous in UFO terms because it's an official US Air Force document, and it's referred to as the Holt Memorandum. And that was written by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt, who was then the deputy base commander of Bentwaters and Woodbridge. And that memo that's on the screen there is only 3 paragraphs. It was written 2 weeks approximately after the incident, but it's incredibly important because it acknowledges officially that in the first paragraph, on the first night of the incident, which is the Christmas night into Boxing Day, 25th into the 26th, that there was a landed triangular craft found on or near to the ground in the forest, Rendlesham Forest, and it was approximately 3 meters by 3 meters. And then 2 nights later, if we go to paragraph 3, Lieutenant Colonel Holt, as the story goes out with a small team into the forest because there's been reports that the UFO is back, and he leads a team into the forest, and he too then goes on to have a series of witnesses, multiple objects, and he, in that third paragraph, says, I saw multiple objects too. And it's very rare for someone of his rank, he retired as a colonel, which is an extremely high rank in the US Air Force. It's extremely rare for somebody of his rank to admit on an official US Air Force document that he too saw multiple UFOs. So this is confirmed acknowledgement by the US Air Force, albeit they didn't want this document ever to be released. Colonel Holt did not want it ever to be released. He tried to get it stopped from being released because he knew that if it did come out, his life would probably never be the same. And I guess it hasn't to this day. And he's kind of haunted by this experience in some ways. But it's an extremely complex case. Now, there's a kind of a misnomer in some ways. People only think of the Rendlesham Forest incident as literally those 2 events, a landed craft on the first night and then Holt seeing multiple UFOs 2 nights later. Well, my reinvestigation, by breaking incidents down based on the testimony that's already been out there and then added to it with re-interviews that I've done, it breaks down into 17 different incidents over at least 3 days of consecutive activity, but probably highlight hints at a fourth night, the 28th into the 29th, which is new. Because that's based on Adrian Bustinza, and he said that he was involved in a second night. I think we'll come back to Bustinza later, but his testimony is absolutely, arguably
Stunning.
most important of all the
Absolutely. It's absolutely stunning. So we've all heard, and I'd also recently interviewed John Burroughs about his involvement. I've talked to James Peniston as well. And we know about this story, what they saw, that Burroughs was going down on the forest floor while James Penniston proceeded towards the craft, and he allegedly touched it and even saw some symbols that were on the side of that craft. Can you tell me something about this, and also about the binary code that he allegedly received days after the event?
Well, if you've read the book, and I think you have, then you'll know that what I've tried to do, because it is so complex and there has been so many conflicting accounts over many years, as a former detective, if you're going to do kind of an evidential review, you've got to take sentiment out of it, and you've literally just got to look at the facts, or ascertain the facts as best you can and evaluate them. And when you do that, then there is no doubt that Jim Penniston was involved with John Burroughs in what is regarded as the first night, and it's regarded as the first night landing. This object is on or near the ground. Now, the difference is that everybody's perception is slightly different. The closest person to the landed object was Jim Penniston, who says he walked around it, touched it, photographed it. The photographs later came out fogged. He took them to the base photo lab and they came out fogged. Whereas John Burroughs was several meters further back, and John Burroughs didn't describe it as a black triangular object or a structured craft. He described it really as a series of lights, a configuration of lights that suggested that there may be structure behind it. But his perception was further back, so it was different, and that's fine. But undoubtedly, they were both involved in that first incident. Jim Penniston said that when he walked around it, he felt like black glass. It looked like black glass. It felt like glass. And at one point, he said that there was like raised etchings and some symbols. Now, he did not mention publicly to a wide audience that he'd had a supposed alleged downloaded binary code, a series of zeros and ones when he touched the symbols for 30 years. So that is kind of quite controversial in itself, that he didn't tell anybody for 30 years. So the symbols he recorded in his pocketbook at the time, although the pocketbook didn't emerge until the late 1990s. Nobody had seen it. But then he said, well, I wrote these things down in my pocketbook. Now, that's fine. It's accepted that he did so. But the binary code is problematical in many ways for me as a detective, because he made so many inconsistent remarks about it when he announced this new information at the 30th anniversary of the incident in 2010 in Woodbridge. And I think you were there because you actually interviewed them the day after, or
yes,
the days afterwards. So there's two very good interviews that you did that are referenced in the book that actually contain a lot of good information because it's early information. But for me, as a detective looking at the binary code, it's what we'd call a standalone account. There is only Jim Penniston that's saying that he'd had this transfer of information. I've suggested to his co-author, Gary Osborne, the book Rendlesham Enigma, his co-author, that it would be a good idea to have a lie detector test, which wouldn't prove it definitively, but it would help his case if he was to pass that. He hasn't undertaken one, as far as I'm aware. But what really was difficult for me is that when he was in Woodbridge, he gave some information that basically said, this is, I've never told about it before. But in reality, when you looked back and you watched the video, because somebody fortunately taped it, and it's out there on the internet, and I put out the tube a link to it. So we've got that for posterity. He actually contradicts himself, because he then says, well, in 1994, I did hypnosis, and it featured in a book, and I worked with Linda Moulton Howe, who was very prominent in the US as a writer and researcher for a long, long time. And it was completely lost on the audience, because they were still coming to terms with the fact that he'd saying that this has just happened and I'm only telling you about it now. So a lot of the people, I think, were quite suspicious of this. But then he came out with this line that it had been in a book, and I found the book. And there is a partial transcript of an interview that he'd done from a hypnosis session that he'd had in September 1994. And the first question in the book is, can you see the binary codes? Well, if he didn't know what they were up until 1994 and he thought they were gibberish, surely when he'd been filmed and watched the interview back, that he would say, well, what am I saying there? Binary codes, what's binary codes? So if he didn't know, he would have found out then, in my opinion. He then went on a radio show that I think is quite damning for him, because he does a show called the Angela Joyner Show, around the 11th, 12th of January, 1981. This is 2010, 2011. So January the 10th, 2011, around that time, early January, he goes on this radio show, a USO podcast, Angela Joyner, who's sadly not with us anymore, but it's there for posterity. And he says things like, there are 6 pages, there are 9 pages, there are 11 pages, there are 14 pages where he'd written down in this kind of auto response the next day, 27th December, he'd written down 001110001, that kind of thing in like an automatic writing. That's what he suggested. But he was inconsistent with the pages. He'd said at the Woodbridge conference that he didn't know what they were. Well, he did, because he'd found out in 1994. And at the very latest, 1998, when the book was released by Linda Moulton Howe. So it was there then. But then he said things on the Angela Joyner show where he said, I knew what it was all the time. And he basically saying that it's time travelers coming back from the future from, I think, 8,100. And they're just doing some kind of experimentation or research back in this. But it's an incredible tale, and it outlines 7 geographical points around the Earth, coordinates that hold all this ancient information. And I think there's going to be a second book and whatever. But the point is, evidentially, it's a standalone account. It's a huge thing, and there are lots of inconsistencies he made with it. So I think in the book, I just basically say it's unproven, it's a standalone account, and should be regarded as unproven. Because you wouldn't change the world on the strength of one person saying something, because so many people would say, well, I'm Jesus reincarnated and whatever. But nobody's going to just believe that. There has to be evidence that backs it up. And for me, it's problematical. So I'll leave it at that, to say that it's problematical.
Yeah. You have worked at the Royal Air Force, and you were also involved in nuclear missile sites back then. Did this help you to investigate the case?
Yes, and it's how I initially got involved in public research, is because between 1983 and 1989, I served at 2 Royal Air Force bases called RAF Honington in Suffolk. And that was a tactical nuclear base with a weapons storage area very similar to the one at RAF Bentwaters. And I guarded tactical nuclear weapons. So I knew how many were on shift. I knew exactly what the US Air Force counterparts did. And it hinted at me that there must be many more witnesses, purely because of the number of people involved per shift, which is approximately around 45 people per shift to guard a nuclear weapons facility and mobile patrols, doing general security of the bases, etc. So this is a highly complex thing. I then was transferred to a tour in West Germany, what was then West Germany, to RAF Larbruck, which was down by the Dutch border near Venlo, right on the southern end of Germany. And I did about 2.5 years there, and about 18 months of my time there was again guarding tactical nuclear weapons on the weapons storage area. So I was very familiar with the procedures involved in that, and it gave me a unique insight. But it also said to me that there are probably many more witnesses, purely because of the number of people involved, and there were, prior to my reinvestigation, alleged stories of beams going down into the weapons storage area directed by a UFO. So we'll maybe come back to that. But yeah, I had a big interest and an extensive background in protecting tactical nuclear weapons.
Yes. So a lot of witnesses have come forward. In the meantime, some of them are very known. Some of them are hardly known in the public. And one of those witnesses or one of those people involved in the incident is this young lady here, who seems to have experienced something earth-shattering, right? Who is this lady? Who is this lady? What did she experience?
The lady that you put on the screen there is a lady called Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin, who obviously at that time was a young black female officer, very popular, very well regarded, and she was a shift commander on one of the 4 shifts. Essentially, there were 2 main shifts, C Flight and D Flight, who did the most of the guarding of the weapon storage area, etc., mobile patrols. So she was a shift commander, and what had been, prior to my reinvestigation, we'd known part of the story. And what we knew from several people, military witnesses, had heard her being very distressed over the radio after responding to a report of a red glowing object dropping down into Rendlesham Forest. She happened to be on mobile patrol. And the existing story that we knew prior to the reinvestigation was that she'd been on mobile patrol and responded to this report of an object descending into the forest. And then the next thing on the radio, she's screaming, "Help, help, help," and asking for Bobby Ball, Sergeant Ball, to come and help her. Now, that's all we really knew, apart from the fact that something distressed her so much that she was taken off shift and never actually went back on shift. And that's basically where it was. But I had a chat with an airman at the time called Michael Stacey Smith, who was an interesting character himself, because he had an earlier, what I call a precursor case, earlier in 1981, where he saw like a red beach ball sized glowing object just outside the fence line at RAF Woodbridge, very close to the East Gate. And he was so shocked by this that he asked for a backup response. Some 2 people came out to back him up, and he had his gun drawn, what was called an M60 heavy machine gun, targeted on this red glowing beach ball size object that was just moving very parallel with the fence line. And one of the airmen that came out went towards it, and he actually said that had that object have been any kind of threat or done something towards the aim, he said, I was cocked and ready to fire at this thing. So that was a very important precursor that happened earlier in 1980. And then he's on over the Christmas period as well of the main December events that we're talking about, these 17 events. And basically what he will say is that he was suddenly dispatched whilst he was at RAF Bentwaters, and there were 2 bases, but he was at RAF Bentwaters. He is suddenly told to go to the back gate of RAF Bentwaters, what's called the Butley Gate. It's a rear access to a public road. It's just a shortcut, basically, from the base. And he was ordered to get to the gate, open it up, because something was happening, and he didn't know what. And so he goes there, opens up the gate, and then he sees a series of vehicles approaching at high speed. So he thinks, something's happening. He doesn't know what. He opens the gate, and off these 2 or 3 vehicles go out in a hurry off to somewhere, and he doesn't know where. Approximately a few minutes later, he then sees one of these vehicles that had gone out to the forest come back, and it's been driven by Sergeant Robert Ball. And again, if you remember, I said he was the first one apparently to respond to the cries of Lieutenant Tamplin. He got to her first. Well, Michael Stacey Smith, as a direct witness, sees her in the passenger seat with Robert Ball coming back in through that gate. And he notes her demeanor, which he says she hasn't got a berry on, she's upset, she's shaking, she's crying, she's disheveled, as if something really traumatic had happened to her. Off they go through the gate and onto the base. He doesn't really know what's happened. And then a few minutes after that, her vehicle that she'd been driving then comes back to the Eastgate where he still is. And this time, this vehicle has sustained roof damage. It's still drivable, but it's sustained vehicle damage, consistent with it having rolled into a ditch, shall we say, and then obviously crumpled part of the upper part of the roof. And it's still drivable. It comes in, and he still doesn't really know what's happened. But this is first-hand testimony that her vehicle is damaged and that she's in a very distressed, disheveled state. He then is called in to one of the sergeants who he knew well, who told him the story. Now, this is where we go to what's called hearsay. It's not a direct testimony. It's told to him by a third person. But there is no reason to think that this person is going to lie, and it kind of matches the story. And the sergeant said, if I tell you what happened to her, you must promise me you'll never give me my name out to the public or to anyone. And he promised, and he kept that. And so I don't know who that actual sergeant was. But the story goes that when she's on this public road, she's heard and said, I'll respond to that. The red glowing object go down into the forest. And then as she's driving on a rural back country road between the bases of RAF Bentwaters on her way to Woodbridge and the forest, she then is confronted by an orange-red glowing object, a UFO for want of a better word, that is literally following her vehicle very close to her car, and it upset her so much, frightened her so much that she lost control of the vehicle on a public road and then rolled the vehicle into a ditch. She got out. She was obviously disheveled, but she was uninjured, and she got out. And when she got out, the red, orangey, glowing object was there, motionless, hovering close nearby, at close proximity to her location. She was absolutely terrified, so she picked up her M16 rifle, machine gun rifle, and she discharged several rounds. She fired at it several times because she was terrified, as you would be. And then the object disappeared. That's when she'd gone on the radio, help, help, help. Robert Ball turns up, and that's the missing part of the story. The key thing with all of this is that it's very serious to discharge your weapon unless you've got real cause. And ordinarily, it's a very serious thing. And it is obviously a serious thing, but this is unusual circumstances.
And this was on British soil, right?
British soil. The police weren't called. It was all hushed up. And they replaced the rounds, however many rounds she'd fired off at this object. They replaced the rounds, so everything checked and balances, because at the beginning of the shift, you sign out for so many rounds, and then you give them back at the end. And if you sign out 50, you give back 50. Well, obviously, she'd been a number of rounds down, so they replaced them in part of a cover-up. No records made, whatever. Now, it turns out that Bonnie Tamplin was then shipped back to the United States, flown back to the United States within days, and never went back on shift. And I'm not sure really what happened to her after that. I suspect that she left the Air Force, but I don't know that for certain. I've tried to trace her. I know which country she lives in. She's in a European country, but I'm not going to go beyond that. I've tried contacting relatives, but she clearly doesn't want to talk, and I have to respect that. But I kind of hope that one day she might want to, maybe just to get it off her chest. I have no reason to doubt the account given by Michael Stacey Smith. And albeit there's a hearsay element, what we do know, we know for a fact that she was out on mobile. We know for a fact that she was heard by several military personnel being distressed over the radio. We now have that direct testimony that he saw Robert Ball bringing Lieutenant Bonnie Tamplin back through the East Gate, looking dishevelled, not wearing a beret, clearly traumatized by something. And then we have the direct testimony from Smith saying that the vehicle had sustained vehicle damage, which is all consistent with the story of what happened to her. Now, this is a sensational story, by definition, a cover-up, because nobody was truly aware of this, and it's all happened on the British public road. So I think alone, this is a truly sensational account, and it was all covered up.
And seems to be not the only witness testimony that was covered up. There's some rumor that people were debriefed after the incident.
It's not a rumor. It's not a rumor, Robert. There'd always been a number of people who claimed that they'd been harshly interviewed, shall we say, or interrogated, which is probably the better word. And even Colonel Holt admitted in the years afterwards, when he appeared on TV, that several people had been given a hard time. Now, it's believed that this interrogation, I think is a better word, and we'll come on to why, was carried out largely by the Air Force Office of Special Investigation, the AFOSI, as it's called, the AFOSI. And they were like the plainclothes detectives of the military, and they had a lot of powers. Now, several people had already gone on the record before I kind of reevaluated this. Ed Kabanzak, who was involved in the first night incident, where he was the driver for Jim Penniston, who took him into the forest. He said he got a hard time and was told, yeah, you didn't see anything, you saw a lighthouse. Sign this statement. And he said, I won't sign the statement. And eventually a statement is produced that he said, I didn't write that. I'd written a different statement. Jim Penniston was given a hard time. He says that he was interviewed many times. Bear in mind, he was the one who got closest to the object, touched it, etc., made drawings of it. He was given sodium pentothal, an injection, truth serum, and literally he gave a statement, and then his statement, was not really. It came out as handwritten, but he was given a really hard time. Larry Warren, who was the original military whistleblower, he'd been interrogated and given a hard time. I then re-interviewed Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, who corroborated that he was taken to an underground facility and given a really hard time and traumatized, threatened with his life, bullets are cheap, etc. And, there's no two ways about it. I think there's clear evidence that several people were given a hard time. I think, go on, carry on.
Yes. So they didn't want the witnesses to speak up, right? That's yes. Why they had the debriefing. So what on earth happened during those nights? We just showed Larry Warren here, who was one of the first witnesses ever to come to go public with this.
He was the first military witness. He wouldn't have been. There was another guy who would have had that title called J.D. Ingalls, but he never went public with his real name, J.D. Ingalls. He went under a pseudonym as Steve Roberts, but he would have had that, but he has never gone public as such, whereas Larry Warren did go public in late 1982, starting to talk about this, and went public and gave his name and appeared on camera by the end of late 1983. And for about 8 years, he was on his own doing interviews. But his account turns out to be completely different to the account that's later given by Lieutenant Colonel Holt, Sergeant Jim Penniston, and Airman John Burroughs. Now, but at the time, they were still in the Air Force, so they weren't talking about this. So for 8 years, it was really Larry Warren's account. And then they retire in the early 90s, and they come out and say, well, actually, we don't recognize Larry Warren's account. So then it threw up all this controversy that's gone on over many years. Now, that's now been settled because I re-interviewed Adrian Bustinza. And I mean re-in the sense that I'd not spoken to him before, but over the years, he'd given various accounts where he'd always said, I think on 8 or 9 accounts over a 40-year period, that Larry Warren had been involved with him in what turns out to be a second landing event. But it had still been highly controversial, and he hadn't really done an audio interview or a video Skype or anything like that. A very reluctant witness. But anyway, I managed to...
Yeah, so what did Larry Warren say, first of all? What's his story?
Yeah. Right. Larry Warren's story says that he was involved in an event in a field, what turns out to be what's called the Farmer's Field, which is a part of Rendlesham Forest. And in that field, he said that originally when he was brought to the area with many others, he went into a field and saw a number of security police officers, US Air Force security officers, approximately 15 to 20, in a circle that appeared to be guarding or protecting a ground-hugging yellow kind of green fog, a yellow mist that was hugging the ground that glowed, an eerie kind of circular patch of mist, odd in itself because it was contained to about 50 feet in diameter. And then as he was sent into the field to join this cordon around this, he then hears somebody says, "Here it comes," and he looks up and he sees a small red light come from the direction of the sea, and this red light is the size of a beach ball, and it stops over this mist, and then suddenly there's a huge explosion of light, and everybody's kind of like, it's so bright that you're rubbing your eyes, recoiling from it. And then when their eyes readjust, where the mist had been, there was a shimmering, translucent craft on the ground, and where the mist had been. And then, incredibly, this incident is being filmed. Larry Warren said that this incident was being filmed on early video, and there were early videos at that time, and on cinefilm cameras. So two people, he said, were filming it from a distance, were filming the whole incident. Then he said that senior officers, including the base commander, well, the base commander of 12,000 personnel was a guy called Colonel Gordon Williams. He turns up with other senior officers, and they approach this shimmering craft. And then an amazing thing, according to Warren, happens where something akin to a bubble slips off the fabric, not through a doorway, not through a window. Something just slips or emerges from the craft as a single bubble that then divides into three bubbles that each contain a humanoid figure, upper torso, who are floating beside this translucent, shimmering craft. You couldn't look at it direct. It would distort. So you had to look peripherally at it. And these three, whatever you want to call them, entities, aliens, whatever, who knows, but three entities of some description were there floating next to it. And Warren says he saw Colonel Williams have almost like a silent face-off, no conversation, but they were looking at him and he was looking at them. And then he is tapped on the shoulder and told to go back to where he'd come, what's called the staging area, where all the vehicles couldn't go any further into the forest. So that became known as the staging area where they had to leave the vehicles. So he left the incident ongoing. Now, for a long time, he had that incident. It was so different from what John Burroughs had said, from what Jim Pennison had said, and what Colonel Holt had said. So you end up with years and years of disinformation, and it developed into quite a personal and heated exchange where people were calling, no, that didn't happen. Anyway, the real breakthrough was when I interviewed Sergeant Adrian Bustinza. I tried to get him several times and didn't, and then eventually he agreed through another airman, who was actually a woman called Laurie Rayfelt. She was the one who'd said, speak to Gary, he's a good guy. So anyway, it was arranged and I spoke to him, and I ended up having a 4.5-hour transatlantic phone call that actually cost me £180, but it was the best £180 I'd ever spent, because he really got into what I was trying to do, and I tried this enhanced cognitive method. And cutting a long story short, I just let him talk, and it was like a cathartic experience. And he let a lot of things out. It was audio recorded. And he basically then confirmed in the latter hour of that 4.5-hour interview, I was getting tired. It had happened during the night. So for me, I'm up all through the night. The sun's come up, and I'm flagging. This is a long interview, and you have to concentrate when you're being an interviewer, because you're the one thinking of all the questions, etc., and absorbing the answers. You know this well from your media, and it's an extremely tiring process. And so I eventually said, "Look, I'm not going to. I'm going to have to lead you a little bit here because I'm flagging. I'm really tired." I said, but you haven't really talked about Larry Warren, and I want to draw your attention to an interview that you did with a Connecticut police detective in 1984. So one of the earliest interviews on record for the whole of any of the witnesses. And he talked extensively about seeing a landed craft. This is Adrian Bustinza's account. So I said, tell me about that. And he said, Larry Warren was involved, but it was on another night. And I went, what? And he said, yeah, this is a second night for me, a second incident for me, which was new, completely new. And this is why it hints at a fourth night. Now, we're not certain that it's fourth night because his date recall isn't great. But we know from all the other things that it's likely to be a fourth night with all the other information. But the key thing is what he remembered. And he said openly, he said Larry Warren was closer to the shimmering craft than I was, and that it had been around security police all around it, that it had been filmed. So it corroborated Warren's account. After all of these years of conflict, he's corroborating it absolutely 100%. And he also said that Colonel Williams, the base commander, was there. And indirectly, in the book, there is a chapter there about, as an aside, but it ties in with this, where we go to a chapter in the book that's about what's called the Charles Holt James Exxon story. And that relates to an admission, cutting a long story short, it relates to an admission that Colonel Holt had made on the telephone to a MUFON researcher called Ray Boucher, who was the first person to actually interview him in 1985. Rang him up, spoke to him, explained who he was, said he was working with Senator James Exxon, who was the senator for Nebraska, and he had talked to other witnesses. He'd talked to Larry Warren, Ray Boucher, and Ray Boucher knew the story, knew the Warren story, and laid it all out for Colonel Holt. You should bear in mind that Colonel Holt is still in the Air Force at this time. He is not retired, so he's still in the Air Force. He relates this story of the second landing, of that it's been filmed, that Colonel Williams is there, the base commander of 12,000 personnel, and at the end of it, he writes verbatim Holt's reply when he's laid out all of this, and he's reporting, in a sense, he wants a response to give to Sergeant Exxon, Senator Exxon. So when he asks Holt, giving him all this information, he notes Holt's verbatim reply, and his reply was, I can verify all of that for the senator. He wrote it down word for word, verbatim. And I got a copy of his Ray Boucher's research notes. Now, that is incredible because Holt has never mentioned that again, has totally denied that Williams was involved, has been highly critical of Larry Warren's account. But now we have a second corroboration by Adrian Bustinza saying, no, Warren was there, but it's on a different night, which helps maybe clear up some of the confusion that's arisen. But it's a clear corroboration. And you know, all the debate about Warren was ended because when you looked at an historical account also by a guy called, a military witness called Greg Batcham, who was also interviewed by this Connecticut police officer, Larry Fawcett, in 1984. And there's a long interview that's been out there, but most people aren't even aware of it. And he says, as I was spooked by, he was involved in an incident himself with three others. They got spooked by mist on the ground and possibly some kind of craft and life form that they ran away frightened. And they're running towards the staging area just as more people are arriving. And Greg Batcham says, and I saw Larry Warren arriving just as I was running away. So that's another partial corroboration. And then to cap it, Steve Longero emerged, and I re-interviewed him. He'd already been this guy. Yeah, he and Steve Longero. He went on to have a 30-year policing career. Was a sheriff. You know, very absolutely top guy. No reason to think that he's going to lie. And the interesting thing about that was he had served on the same induction training course at Lackland Air Force Base as Larry Warren. And if anybody who's been in the military, you clump together with all these people on your intake, you do all the basic training together. Now, you get close to a few people who are around you in the dorm or wherever you sleep, you get you tend to maybe know 5 or 6 people really well, and you'll recognize and know of the others in your group because you're marching with them, you're doing all your training with them, so they're like part of your classroom. If you think in school terms, they're part of your class, so you know who they are, but you don't really know them very well. And that was the basis on which Steve Longero came forward. And Longero had been disgusted by the way that Warren was absolutely being castigated. You weren't there, you're a liar, blah, blah, blah. And this was before I got this account from Adrian Bustinza. And he came forward to me and he said, I saw Larry Warren on the night I was out in the forest, and I was pleased to see him because I was it was my first tour overseas, and he said something was going on. We didn't really know what it was. So it was good to see a face that I knew, albeit not well, but it was good to see somebody because they'd had this bit of training together. So they were keeping their head down thinking, what's going on with all this stuff in the forest? So that's a brilliant trigger memory as to why he remembers Larry Warren being there. So that hints that Steve Longero's night was maybe a 4th night, and he's not sure about the dates, but he is clear that Warren was there. And ironically, he says that he saw Warren at the staging area, i.e. where all the vehicles had to be left because they couldn't go any further into the forest, and that the person who was telling them what to do was Colonel Holt. Now, Colonel Holt has been a massive person against Larry Warren, literally as soon as he retired, saying that's a load of rubbish, the guy's a wannabe, he's not involved. And here we are, we've got Steve Longero saying, I see him out in the forest. And then we've got this absolutely brilliant testimony from Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, finally does an audio interview to me, and he says, yeah, Larry Warren was there, but it's a different night. And that was the big thing. So to my mind, that's all settled now. There is no debate. There's 3 people corroborating that Warren was involved in one of the nights of the activity. So that's over and done with. That's corroboration in my eyes as a former detective. So that debate is over. But you'll still get people who will try to challenge it, but they're just going to ignore the evidence, and that's the evidence.
Now, I talked to John Burroughs, and he confirmed that he is receiving a disability pension from the U.S. government because of the health effects that this craft or whatever happened back then had on his eyes, on his heart. Mm-hmm. Now there is, in this 3rd night or 4th night, we don't know exactly, this incident with the yellow mist, the light explosion, and then a craft forming in front of 10 to 15 security personnel standing around it. From all the witnesses that you've talked to, have you found anyone describing health effects similar to the ones that John Burroughs described?
Yes. Now, before I go on to that, I must make it clear that John Burroughs was not involved in that incident in the field. He has never said he was involved in that incident in the field. He wasn't aware of that, and he certainly wasn't involved in that. However, John Burroughs has at least 3 incidents, one of which is the initial landing, although he didn't get that close to it. Then he 2 nights later is involved in what's called the 3rd night, the Holt night, the famous audio tape that Holt makes on a little dictaphone of what is effectively a live event and he does little short updates over what is a 4.5 hour period. On that 2nd night or 3rd night, the Holt night, John Burroughs is off duty. He feels just something in his bones, as it were, that something is going on. So he gets a lift to the base. He gets a lift out to the forest, and basically he feels compelled to go. And I've obviously met John several times, and he's no two ways about it. He's a direct witness, and he has 2 incredible experiences close hand. Well, on the 1st night, there's conjecture that there was some missing time, as in the alien abduction missing time, at least 45 minutes, but by some accounts, it could be up to several hours. We'll not go into that, but it's in the book where I substantiate the fact that the people Holt talks about they were gone for hours and they didn't know. That's what he actually says on a videotape. video that I recorded, or my wife recorded. But going back to John Burroughs, he had an incredible incident with Adrian Bustinza. So on that night that Holt is out with his team, they're out for hours, and then they come back to the staging area where John Burroughs is waiting. He speaks to Holt, and Holt said, okay, you can go back out. They'd come back in. His group, Holt's team, had come back in, and he said, yeah, go out. And he said, I want to take Adrian Bustinza with me, Sergeant Bustinza with me. So Bustinza, who was obviously involved in Holt's team, I guess reluctantly, but said, okay, I'll go out with John for a few minutes and just see what happens. Well, they leave the staging area, the two of them, Burroughs and Adrian Bustinza, and they apparently have another encounter a few minutes later on a pathway close to what's called this farmer's field. The actual location has not been positively identified, but that's how it's described, a pathway close to the field. And what happens was that John Burroughs is slightly ahead, walking ahead of Adrian Bustinza. Adrian Bustinza says that he feels as if he is pushed from behind and he falls forward. And as he falls to the ground, he looks forward to see John Burroughs suddenly being engulfed in an extremely bright beam of light. So so part of the light that lights up the area also strikes Adrian Bustinza, and it strikes him on his hand and part of his groin area, and he has had medical issues ever since, which we think by this beam of light affecting his health ever since.
So Adrian Bustinza has health effects as well. What kind of problems does he have?
He has a rash on his fingers, and on his groin area there is a rash around there, and he associates that directly. And he is also getting a pension from the VA, but I don't think they will say definitively to him, and I don't think they said it definitively to John. He's got it, but I think unofficially they've got it because of their injuries. I don't think officially it's actually in black and white, although I think John put out a press release inferring that. But I asked John to send me the actual wording. I didn't want to know the amounts that he got or whatever, but I wanted to see the wording, and he didn't do so. So I don't think it's as definitive as what John says it is, but clearly he's in receipt of a medical pension, as is Adrian Bustinza, as is Jim Penniston, people who've had close proximity. But let's talk about John Burroughs, because he had that incident where he's engulfed in the light. And Adrian Bustinza, when I interviewed Adrian, he said, as I am looking forward, John is engulfed in this incredibly bright light, and he says, I saw John in the middle, and then I saw an outline to his left and an outline to the right side of him, inferring that there was some other living thing there on the left side and right side with John in the middle, which is an incredible account. Now, here's the new information that we had partly known about, but not in as much detail. But when Adrian says that they got back to Holt after this incident, he said it was only to him and John 10, 15 minutes maximum that they'd been out, and then they'd come back. Now, Holt was, apparently when they got back, Holt was angry at them. Where have you been? Where have you been? And he indicated that they'd been gone for around 40 minutes. So again, you have this 20, 25 minutes of missing time where you think something may have, in the abduction sense, happened to them. And clearly, with him seeing objects to the left and right of Burroughs, it conjures up there was some kind of interaction there. So that's an incredible account there.
Now, you also talked to another witness that we can see here, and he has a completely different story to tell that I've never heard about, which is quite fascinating. What happened to this man?
Well, there is an update to this, and I actually put something out on Facebook yesterday. In the last few days, James Stewart's account, which is in the book, I think chapter 20, is somebody that came to me after I'd done these interviews with Longero and Adrian Bustinza. And he came out of the blue, and he is what was called a crew chief. He was an airman, but he was somebody that referred to as a crew chief. They were responsible for repairing aircraft. He is not US Air Force Security Police, which is highly pertinent. But the new information is that in the last few days, he said he has checked his evaluation records for the time period of his service career. And he has established that his event, which he said to me initially was December the 26th, 1980, was actually December the 26th, 1979. So it takes him out of the main collection of events, hence why in the book it said 18 events in the conclusion, because that included that. But based on this new information, it's now 1979. But his account is exactly the same. And his account is incredible, because what he basically says is that he is working on an F-4 Phantom jet, and it's recently had a new canopy fitted, and he's underneath in the bomb bay, and there is a ladder going up to the cockpit, and he's underneath, and then suddenly he feels a vibration as if somebody was stood on the spine of the craft. And it shuddered a little bit, and he thought, what's that? And so this is the middle of the night, Christmas, Boxing night into the 27th. And then basically he feels this vibration, and so he comes out from underneath the vehicle, and then he feels another vibration, which is as if something had jumped from the tail of the aircraft down to the ground, which is approximately 8-9 feet, which is not an easy thing to do. Didn't see what the object or whoever it was. But he goes up the ladder after the first judder and sees claw marks, 3 scratches in what was a new canopy of an F-4 Phantom. Weird. He then goes down and he notices with the second vibration that in the dew, the night dew that was forming on the spine of the good to the tail, there was some kind of footprint, but he couldn't make out what it was. But there was some impression. And the weird thing is that when this second vibration, as if something had jumped down to the ground, he then sees, without ever actually identifying what it was, he sees something akin to a deer or something moving through the bushes towards the perimeter fence line. He was very close to the fence line at the east gate of Area Woodbridge. And then he says it almost like passed through the fence and was then seen outside of the fence, and it was moving away to his left. At the same time, he says that he sees a strange UFO-shaped object descending into the forest, vertically down, descending into the forest, that then goes behind a clump of trees that were near the east gate then. It doesn't look like that now because there was a great storm. All the trees got knocked down, so it's new trees there now. But in 1979, there was a lot of trees closer to the east gate, and this object was going down. He also then hears shots fired from the security policeman who was by the east gate. This is odd in itself because routinely the east gate was not manned. It was only done at various times when the base was on alert or special duties or whatever. But he heard, it clearly was manned on that occasion, and he heard several shots. So he hit the deck thinking, what's going on? The security policeman was shooting at something, and he was only maybe 50, 60 meters away from the security policeman by the gate. So he knew he was close, and he heard voices along the lines of, get away, something like that, as if the person was frightened. Didn't know who the person was, but the person was clearly distressed by something and had discharged his weapon, which is very rare and very odd. And he, too, had seen an object scurrying through the undergrowth towards the clump of trees where this UFO had been descending down. So if you have a scenario a bit like the film E.T., when he's left behind and he's scurrying to get back to the spaceship and he's a bit too late. Well, you have these two things going through the bushes from two different directions towards what was apparently a landing UFO. And that is when his supervisor turns up in a vehicle, having heard the shots, and says to him, get in, we thought you'd been abducted. We thought, and there was some talk of you might be the fifth one that had been taken, which throws up an amazing new scenario of this seemingly amazing incidents that occurred a year earlier, but are almost rerun of the events that would follow 12 months later. Now, this guy, I've checked his records. He's a very decent guy. I've seen his photos and his service records and whatever. There's no reason to think that this guy's making it up. Yes, he's got the date wrong, but that's only thorough. And as soon as I know, then all I can say is, well, fair enough. And we've now got to put this new information out, and it just means that it's thrown up a whole new different dynamic, which is of a seemingly a major incident that's happened around December of 1980, 79, a full year before the events. So that
precisely 1 year before.
It's almost like they were expected to return. If you think about it, the 1980 events, maybe they were expected more true. And actually, Laurie Warren always said, I always got the impression that they kind of thought that this was going to happen again. And he didn't know why, but this would seem to tie in with that.
So is it because of the location? Is this a hotspot for paranormal activity, or
historically speaking, the area of East Anglia, where the twin bases in the forest are, go back a long time to witchcraft and whatever. But in the modern era, they were involved in the secret research of radar, and there are facilities at Orford Ness, and there's still structures there from the 50s involved in early radar experimentation. It's also the place where they did a lot of testing for nuclear weapons, British nuclear weapons, and developing secret technology around nuclear weapons. So it's synonymous with myth and mystery. However, these are testimonies that are not myth. These are real events that people are reliving. And the events that's occurred there, I think, are related to RAF Bentwaters. RAF Bentwaters contained a nuclear weapons storage area. It was a nuclear base. There are historical records that I mentioned in the book that say that Bentwaters had nuclear weapons. But I think the real thing for me is that Colonel Holt, when I first met him in December of 2007 for what was called the UFO Hunters TV series with Bill Burns, we chatted on the first night we got to the hotel together, and we'd spent some time together, the Holt and I, and he said to me there were more nuclear weapons at Bentwaters than anywhere else in Europe. And I always remember that, and I wrote it down in a book after the incident, because I wanted to remember things, because I was excited to meet Colonel Holt. He was obviously a very famous, well-known person, so I wanted to remember as much as I could from the conversation, and I still have that book. And he said there were more nuclear weapons there than anywhere else in Europe. And that, I think, is quite telling. Now, with regards to the 1980 events, I think the reason why UFOs turn up is because of the nuclear connection. If there were more nuclear weapons there than there should have been, I think that this is akin to a nuclear inspection. And the reason why I think that is because at the time of the December 1980 events, there were two world events going on that could plunge us into a Third World War scenario. The first being what was happening in Poland with Lech Wałęsa and the Polish shipyard workers in Gdansk, and the rising, they were seeking maybe a revolution to get their democracy. And as if people historically know from Czechoslovakia and Hungary, it was still then a Soviet state under the umbrella of the Soviet Union. So at the time of the December 1980 events, hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were massing on the Polish borders, and it looked very much like history would repeat itself, and that they would roll in the tanks and quash the revolutionary element of the shipyard workers. Fortunately, that didn't happen, but that was a world scenario putting everybody on edge. And the other thing that was going on at the time in December 1980 was the Iranian hostage crisis. 52 Americans held by the Iranians, and that was obviously the Middle East and the powder keg of the Middle East. So you had two kind of really dangerous factors going on. And I think the fact that there were so many nuclear weapons hidden at the Bentwaters underground facility, it was a reason why they turn up in so many numbers. And I think, and at one point, if we go on the now testimony that I got from Steve Longero, he said, I was inside walking around the nuclear weapons storage area with an experienced airman when we saw UFO, and then it shone a beam down into the hot row of the nuclear bunkers.
Yeah, let's go into this quickly, because we already running more than 1 hour. Let's go quickly into the testimony of Steve Longero. What did he see?
Basically, he has 2 incidents to report. And the first one is he's inside the nuclear weapons storage area and walking around with an experienced airman. The reason why that was is because he was new. He'd only been on shift a few days, so he wasn't experienced enough to be walking around on his own inside the weapons storage area. So he was being shadowed, in effect. And then he said he saw a UFO by the fence line that then shone a beam down into the bunkers and proceeded to do this like a grid search pattern, working its way down all the bunkers. The beam was casting left to right, as if you were scanning the entire hot row. So it's a long straight row of bunkers with nuclear weapons. And after that, the object then went off, the beam went off, and the object went out towards Rendlesham Forest. And he heard people on the radio, and he says he heard Jim Penniston being on the radio. So this throws up another conundrum, because according to Jim Penniston, he was given a 6-day break and he shouldn't have been on duty. But he says very clearly, I heard Jim Penniston directing people to go to the forest. Because he was new onto shift, and because there was something then happening in the forest, there was clearly a panic situation, and people were pulled off from ordinary duties that they wouldn't ordinarily do. And that ties in with what Larry Warren was said. Larry Warren said he was at perimeter post 18, just a little concrete box at Bentwaters, and he was told to close it down, and he'd get picked up, taken into the forest, didn't know why. Steve Longero is taken from the weapons storage area because he's actually new on shift. He's like supernumerary, so they take him off, and he's then taken into the forest with another 10 or 15 people, and this is before Holt ever gets involved, and they're taken by Penniston, he says. This is his testimony, not mine. He says that he's taken by Penniston to the original landing site from 2 nights earlier, and whilst they're there, they too have a UFO encounter, and 10 or 15 all witness this. Totally unknown. Nobody had ever mentioned this before. There'd been rumours of the beam going down, but now we've got direct testimony, which is really important. You put his name to it, sign a statement to that effect, and then he is taken from the weapons storage area out into the forest and has a UFO incident himself with many others. That was completely brand new. So nobody, until I'd spoke to him about this, nobody was aware of this incident at all. So again, he plays a key role. And in the middle of that, he says that he saw Larry Warren at the staging area where Holt turned up and started to brief people and said, you go off there, you go off there. And that's his story. But it's an amazing story. And it plays a key new chapter. And these kind of people, instead of being encouraged to come forward, they're verbally attacked. Holt is really, he wasn't involved. No, he couldn't have been, blah, blah, blah. Instead of welcoming him as a senior officer, I've always thought you should be putting your arms around and saying, look, you're all part of this. We'll all be together. You're all, whether you've been in it a lot or a little, you're still a part of this. But it's been so disruptive, and any new witnesses come forward, they seem to be attacked, and that's not right, because there are many other people in the wings, I think, who have got accounts, but they've told me they do not like the way the case is presented, the narrative as it's portrayed in the TV. It's literally Holt, Penniston and Burroughs, and that's it. Nobody else gets a look in. And that's not right, because these new testimonies are vital. And why should these people lie? You know, Adrian Bustinza was a law enforcement for 30 years, very similar career to me. Steve Longero, very similar, 30 years, law, absolutely upright, standing guy. And there's no reason why these are going to lie. And they deserve to have their testimonies heard as well.
And you have collected all these witness testimonies and much more information in your new book, Non-Human, the Rendlesham Forest UFO Incidents, 42 Years of Denial, which is a fascinating book and written by a police detective who knows how to interview witnesses. And this certainly sheds new light on the incident. Thank you so much, Gary Heseltine, for this interview. Please keep us up to date on any new developments. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Robert. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you also for watching. And what can I say? Was that a nuclear inspection by aliens of some sort? This may be an encouraging news or a frightening one. It's up to you to decide. See you. Bye.